Welcome to River Kings. This is definitely one of my top reads of this year. Cat Jarman, who is this fantastic new meteor of both non-fiction and archaeology, who has been appearing frequently on British TV screens, but I think is new to an Indian audience. And her book, River Kings, is really one of the most extraordinary works of archaeology and communication of archaeology that I've ever read. Not only is she capable of making the most arcane scientific details of sort of DNA and bones and carbon-14 dating and how if you eat fish it's different from how if you eat land animals and all sorts of strange details. She can make that sort of thing interesting. She also has one of the most extraordinary tales to tell. The Vikings, familiar as these sort of horned, helmeted figures jumping off boats, turn out to be much more complex figures, and for an Indian audience, much more connected with them than they might expect it, because the whole story revolves around a dig, which, bizarrely enough, I was involved in as a teenager. And soon after completing my O-levels, I went to work in the summer holidays in a vicar's garden in Derbyshire in central England, where we found a mass Viking grave of these extraordinary sort of bulky men, all of whom seemed to be about 6 foot tall, looked like the kind of massacre had taken place at an Olympic team. It was among these extraordinary bones and weapons that we found, someone, and I can't even remember who that year, found a small, tiny garnet bead with a hole through it, ready to be strung. I think I'm right in saying, or as an ornament.
Yes, it was, although it was carnelian rather than garnet, but yes, close enough.
And I don't know which, there were only about 5 or 6 of us working on the site. So, I mean, it could have been me, it could have been someone else, but no one particularly took any notice of it. I just shoved it in a plastic bag and recorded it in the finds register. And it took a young PhD called Cat Jarman, working away in her laboratory somewhere in Scandinavia many years later, to realize that this was not just an interesting curio in a bag, but actually was evidence of Viking trade directly or indirectly with Ahmedabad, with darkest Gujarat, a long way away from the Viking heartlands. So what we're going to do today is Kat is going to take it away, give us a little introduction to her book. I am going to sit quietly and listen for the first 20 minutes and then dive in. As I say, this is something which has always thrilled me because it links, in a sense, the 2 halves of my life. The first half when I was digging Viking bones and the second half in India. And I never thought these 2 would connect until Kat's book, which incidentally is number 2 on the bestseller list and may yet become number 1 next week if we all do our jadoo and say our prayers and make Viking sacrifices and that sort of thing, and resurrect Viking witches. Anyway, over to you, Kat. Please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that, William. And yeah, absolutely, so much appreciate your support for it, and the coincidence that you were actually part of this story that we didn't quite realise. And so what I wanted to do to start with is just sort of go on a little whistle-stop tour through the narrative of this book, but also to try and explain why I wrote it the way I did, what's new and what's exciting. Because if you go online or if you go into a bookshop, there's going to be 40 books on the Vikings, and there's going to be all sorts of stories. We've studied the Vikings for over 100 years, and a lot of those tales have been around. They've been repeated. They've been, the same narratives have been told again and again. And when I finished writing my PhD, I knew I wanted to actually write something for the general public. I wanted to actually express that those stories that we thought we knew aren't actually what we think anymore. There's so much new evidence, a lot of it from science, a lot of it from human remains, from skeletons. My work really mainly is as a bioarcheologist, which means that I study human remains and I look at all the types of chemical analysis, all the things that we can tease out of bones and teeth. Because we are very much like walking
Nordic
diaries.
Noir for archaeologists. This is sort of one of those Nordic noir dramas we watch on Netflix, The Bridge or someone, where someone appears and looks knowingly at a dead body, and then the cat is that for the Viking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a cold case, the Vikings, a very, very cold case, but that doesn't make it any less interesting.
It's thrilling.
Yeah. So it's quite exciting how we can now use those methods, and we can get so much detail, and then we can add that to what we know from more traditional techniques or excavations and objects. We can do the same thing with objects. We can actually analyze the chemicals, and we can look at things like geographical origins, and that's, I think, is what's added a new dimension. So, but when I did my PhD, it was very much the kind of traditional story, really. So it's starting with the site in Repton in Derbyshire, which I'm trying to get my slides to move, and they're not. There we go. The site Repton in Derbyshire, where William excavated in the early 1980s, and that was a site of the Viking Great Army, which was this marauding army from the 9th century that essentially landed in England with the aim of political conquest, moving around, capturing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and doing so quite successfully. It's very much a kind of traditional tale of these Scandinavian warriors who attacked monasteries. So Repton was actually a monastery. We know it was sacked by the Vikings in 873, and that was kind of
maybe for an Indian audience who are not familiar with the kind of basic history. Just give a picture of Anglo-Saxon England and the Vikings' first eruption into this beautiful monastic scene.
Yeah. So at this point, in the late 9th century, the Vikings are old news. The Vikings, the people we call the Vikings, come from Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And sometime in the late 8th century, they start to move outwards. They start to move west and east, as we'll see a bit later on, and initially just raiding, attacking these undefended sites in what was then known as Anglo-Saxon England. There was a lot of wealth there, and it was really looking for portable wealth. So they would go out in the longships and go back again. But about 100 years later, that changed. So people were looking for new territory. They were not just looking for wealth, but they were looking for places to settle. So that's when you start to see this phase where you are attacking things like monasteries, but actually quite successfully, the Scandinavians are also taking over the kingdom. So England is divided into a number of smaller kingdoms. It's not yet a gathered country. They go to Ireland as well as Scotland, and very successfully set up. Places like Dublin was essentially set up by the Vikings. So this in the 9th century has happened for quite a long time. And I'll go on to the eastern part of the Viking world a bit later on. But really, this is kind of what they're known for. So this site in Repton was one of those places that the Vikings came and settled for a winter, and moved on afterwards to sort of conquer a different kingdom. And it was in this context that this bead, this Carnelian bead that William's already mentioned, was discovered. But at the time, it was just seen as one of those things, a little trinket. And it was just hidden in one of these boxes for 40 years until I rediscovered it. But what was so remarkable about it was this fact that it couldn't have come from Britain, couldn't come from Europe, possibly around the Caspian Sea, but almost certainly the most likely origin was somewhere in Gujarat. So when I wanted to put this together and talk about what's new about the Viking, it was this Eastern connection that really interested me. And we've known that the Vikings also traveled east for a very long time. We have these wonderful sagas from the 13th century that actually talk about this. They talk about some of these journeys, but they're almost like historical fiction. So people have seen this as very separate. Some went to the west, went to Britain, and some went down the rivers to the east. But actually, when you find something like this in England, you have to say, well, how did that happen? Were these worlds more connected? There's this other piece of evidence as well that more outside of Scandinavia, more Scandinavian artifacts have been found in Eastern Europe, and especially in Russia, than in Western Europe. So although we might have this image of most of the Vikings going to the west, going to Britain, actually there's a hell of a lot more objects in Eastern Europe. So I started to look at that. I wanted to retrace this journey and looking at the possible steps. So the book basically takes me there. So it takes me from the starting point in Repton, as you can see on the map here, through Scandinavia, down the rivers in Eastern Europe to the Black Sea, to Constantinople, what's now Istanbul, and then finally across to Baghdad and across the Indian Ocean over to Gujarat. So that's essentially the story. But what I'm trying to sort of tell within the story is it's just moving away from this typical narrative. This is Repton. This is a monastery. So this is the site where the bead was found, and this really is what, at least in Northwestern Europe, I think most people think of as a Viking, is this typical attack. But William also mentioned this bone deposit. So this leads me all to my sort of scientific work. So part
this is
of
what I spent my 18-year-old summer holidays digging.
Yes, so that was the exact deposit right there. So this contains the 300 people. They were buried in a mound in the vicarage garden, and some of them were stacked. There were objects, there were artifacts, there were coins dating to the 870s, so it could be dated reasonably accurately. But what I did in my PhD work was very much looking at their origins, looking at things like diet, what they eat and drink, and where they come from. Because, as I said at the beginning, we are these sort of walking diaries. We take up everything from our food and drink, becomes our hair, our fingernails, our skin, and that carries with it chemical signatures. So I grew up in Norway, so my teeth were formed in childhood, and when my teeth were formed, they took up something called isotope ratios of my local climate. So the water, for example, in Norway is very different from the water in India, which will have the markers of a much warmer climate, different geology. That's all trapped into our bodies, into our bones and our teeth. And 1,000 years later, you can come and investigate this. So I spent many years in a lab just staring at teeth and labs and the lab instruments and spreadsheets. But what that told me really was that there was a big diversity among these people. They actually came from a very large number of places. There were men here and also women. And we used to think that only men took part in the outwards expansion, but actually the evidence, the data showed that women were a big part of that too. So that's part of this narrative as well, is sort of women's involvement. But the fact that we have this now means that we can look at different parts of the Viking world, look at how much people traveled, who traveled, where did they go, where did they come from. So a lot of what I'm trying to get into the book is that sort of information. But the other very intriguing connection to the East that's come up more recently is through these coins. So these are dirhams, Islamic coins, and through the work of metal detectorists who go out in the English countryside for the weekend, and they find these objects, they find these silver coins. We now suddenly, over the last 5 or 10 years, have quite a large number. We used to think there weren't so many in England, but now we've got 60, 70 of them. They only come to England from the Middle East with the Vikings. There's no other people, there's no other sort of trade networks that really bring them in at this point in time. And we know that this happens because silver really very much fueled the Viking Age. This is what the Scandinavians desperately wanted, and they got it in the Middle East because these coins were very high quality, very pure silver, and they get melted down into these sort of lumps that you see at the bottom here. And with chemical analysis, we can now actually look at the origins. So although the coins themselves have got, the mint name, the date, you can tell exactly where it's from. These melted down objects, we now, with new methods, can also say are coming from the Middle East. So vast amounts of silver are being funneled into Scandinavia and all the way to Western Europe. So in the book, I talk a lot about how this happened, how the travel, the Viking ship is a huge part of the success of the Vikings, the fact that new ship technology, use of the sails and the keel, have these boats, this is the Gokstad ship from Norway, which can actually go huge difference. They can go across the North Atlantic, the North Sea, and then they can go down, as we'll see in a moment, shallow rivers, land on beaches. So hugely, the technology is there for this to happen. But then if you go back to Scandinavia, as I do in this sort of middle part of the book, the question is why? Why are we getting all the silver from the East? Why are we getting Carnelian? Why are people interested in that? They've got lots of beautiful things. They can make the most wonderful glass beads that are all sorts of designs and pattern. But you also have objects like this one. This is a Buddha statue that was found on the island of Helga near Birka in Sweden, so near modern-day Stockholm, just at the sort of beginning part of the Viking Age. Now, there are no Buddhists, as far as we know, in Scandinavia at the time, but this has still traveled from either India or Pakistan. And it really, I think, demonstrates that objects that come from far away are very highly valued in Viking Age society. But it also shows that those connections are there. And this is the key, essentially, I think, to understanding that global connectedness in the Viking Age is people want these things. They want exotic objects. We have burials full of beads of rock crystal from Sri Lanka, things like this object here, and then it becomes very desirable. So it becomes a fashion trend. These Carnelian beads suddenly in the 8870s sort of explode. They're suddenly everywhere. So people want them. People want the exotic. They want this connection to somewhere else. But it also becomes possible suddenly. Previously, it was possible to get exotic items, but only if you were very high status, if you were sort of very wealthy and you had access to trade connections. But now, in the Viking Age, pretty much anyone, if you have a little bit of money, can go and buy these special imported beads. So that is one of the big changes. And that's changed because these trade routes, actually, if I go back to this map earlier on, these trade routes through the east start at the cusp of the Viking Age. So around about 750, AD 750, we start to see the first trading settlements setting up in what is now Russia. So Staria Ladoga, for example, is one of the first one. It's established around 750. And this area of the Baltic Sea, so bordering Sweden and Finland and parts of Eastern Europe, around that place, that's really where the Viking Age starts. And this is a bit of a new understanding, actually, because we used to think it all starts in the West with attacks on one of the monasteries at Lindisfarne, for example. But actually, the evidence now, the new data is showing that around 750, the focus is very much on the east. So these trading routes start, we get trading settlements going down the Dnieper River, which goes down towards Ukraine and down to the Black Sea, and the Volga, which goes further east. So gradually, well, I say gradually, actually quite quickly, they set up settlements, trading towns along the Eastern River. Those ships, those boats, maybe not the huge ones like the Gokster ship, the smaller ones, can travel very successfully down these rivers. They are not necessarily able to travel the whole way. They'll have to be pulled over rapids, they have to be pulled over land, and we have got some incredible accounts that come out of Constantinople largely describing these rapids and this travel. And part of this is taking advantage of the people who are living there. So the Slavs are very much being taken advantage of by these people who come down the eastern routes. And a big part of that is a slave trade. So the question is, of course, all that silver that comes back to Scandinavia and comes back to the West, it's being given to them in return for something else. So it can be things like amber and furs, but slaves really is one of the key, essentially one of the commodities is enslaved people. In fact, the very word slave comes from the Slavs, the Slavic people, because that slave trade was so prolific in the eastern regions. So this sort of happens in the east around about this time, so starting about 750, 800s. And there's been a big question, a big debate of whether these people are actually Scandinavians. Are they Vikings? Because in the records, in the written documents, they are not known as Vikings, but they are known as the Rus. So the Rus being then the founders of the Rusian state, which of course becomes Russia and Belarus and also parts of Ukraine. And this has been a huge debate. I go into some of the details of that in the book. Because there are accounts, there's something called the Russian Primary Chronicle dating to the about 12th or 13th century, which explains that apparently around about this time, the Slavic tribes were so busy fighting each other, they were completely unable to live peacefully together, that they had to call in somebody else to help them. So they called in these people called the Rus, who came from Scandinavia, and said, please come and rule over us. And in that way, the Rusian state was set up. Now, of course, that's one of the origin stories really for Russia. But of course, you can probably imagine why that was not always so popular, politically speaking. And so this debate of how much that was true or not, if these people are Russians, so Rus are Vikings, has been massively debated. But there are some other accounts. There's some Arabic travel accounts, the most famous one being by somebody called Ibn Fadlan, who, these are travelers who go through parts of the world, including Eastern Europe, for other reasons, and they write down a lot about what they see. Ibn Fadlan happened to come across one of these groups of the Rus, and when he was there, this is early 10th century by the Volga River, he happened to come at a time when one of the chieftains had died, and the funeral was being set up, and he asked if he could observe it, and he observed it and he wrote it down, giving us a contemporary account of a burial. It's an extremely elaborate account of a very long ritual, which includes human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and finally the burning of this great big ship for the chieftain inside it.
I have to break in here.
I know you did. I knew you would. Sorry?
Well, you've missed out the funeral orgy.
Yes, there's a funeral orgy as well. There's all sorts of things happening. There seems to be a big part of it. There's one of the slave girls who volunteers actually to sacrifice herself. So she agrees to become the chieftain's wife in death. And she's then sent around to have sex with all these friends who say they're only doing it for their chief's honor or something like that. But it's a very vivid description of everything that takes place. There's animal sacrifices, all sorts of things. But eventually, the interesting part of it really is that if you look at this description and then you look at some of the ship burials that have been found in Scandinavia, we have some remarkable burials, and they contain exactly the same material. We have these big ships, we have all the sacrificed animals, we have all the objects, we have the dead being laid to rest on a bed in a chamber in the middle of the boat, which is exactly what Ibn Fadlan explains as well. So whether or not these people, the Rus, are Scandinavians, they certainly have this cultural connection. So these are the people who are living then in the East, in Russia at the time. But the question is, of course, where are they going? So these settlements are springing up. They're taking in lots of people. They are funneling silver up and slaves down. And one of the main areas they are going to is Constantinople. So Constantinople really was the sort of key location in the north of the Viking Scandinavian records and sagas. Constantinople is known as Miklagard, which means the big city. So the big city is where you had to go if you wanted to make money. And we've got all sorts of fantastic accounts that have come out of Constantinople, and they tell us about the trading rules. They tell us how beneficial this trade was actually for Constantinople as well, because obviously they wanted these things that they could bring down. So there were things like you could go there and you could get free lodgings for 6 months. You would be allowed to have free Turkish baths, that sort of thing. It was all a sort of really, really, they were being looked after most of the time. But then at the same time, we have other accounts that show us that this was a kind of love-hate relationship. At times, it was very peaceful, very good, a lot of treaties taking place. But at other times, there were raids and attacks. So I think one of the key understandings that we now have of the Viking Age is that these are people who are very adaptable. If they could trade peacefully, they would. If they couldn't, they would raid and attack. So violence was very much a part of the Viking world, but sometimes that wasn't necessary. Sometimes the threat of violence was enough. They had enough of a reputation, as we can see from accounts from France or from England or from these Arabic accounts, and these are very, very strong, very able fighters. But actually the trading in the East, it seems to be that the trade is what's most lucrative. And what they're doing is they're very much tapping into the Silk Road trading networks. So these are networks that have already been established for such a long time, but now the Scandinavians are essentially tapping in literally through those rivers. So they are making the connection between Scandinavia, between the Baltic Sea and then the Black Sea, and then onwards further east as well. So we have some records that we know most people would have gone to Constantinople. Some would have attacked the Caspian Sea. A few also traveled overland by camel caravan to Baghdad. So we know there were trading going on with Baghdad. Part of the key was also the fact that these slaves, pagan slaves, could easily be sold in the Muslim world, where you couldn't enslave other Muslim people. You had to have ideally pagans. So that is part of the success of it, really. This I forgot to mention. This is from Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. If you ever get a chance to go there, go have a look, go upstairs and look at the balustrade. There's an inscription in runes, so the language that was used by the Scandinavians, and it says Halfdan, the name Halfdan for something else, which probably means Halfdan was here. So we have real direct evidence of Scandinavians traveling of recent discoveries, this little kind of dragon on the right, if you can see that, which is actually part of a ship. So on one of the columns is a Viking ship shape, which has got a sail and shields. So this is kind of graffiti, which to me just brings that very kind of real human element to this world. But that's kind of where the trail of the Scandinavian trade with the East stops, because I think, as far as we know, Scandinavians didn't go much further east. It seems like it's the networks, it's the trade from that point on. But my story does end in India. I did travel to Gujarat to look at some of these mines. And I managed to meet a beadworker who still works on traditional bead making techniques with Carnelian, who showed me the methods. And the trade in Carnelian is, I think, pretty much unchanged for the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years, apart from using modern trucks instead of whatever other transport means were used 1,000 years ago. We know that there were certainly Arab traders in the region from about, I think, about the 7th century. There's an account by Al-Masudi, who also talks about the Rus in Eastern Europe, talking about traders by the coast in the year AD 918. So I think that bead started here. It started like this, like one of these quite ugly looking pebbles, and moved across those networks. And it was the fact that the Scandinavians essentially tapped into those networks. They were able to make these global connections, making it possible to travel from east and west so quickly. That is the whole key to it. And so with them, they took with them ideas, people, objects, but also some slightly more damaging things like disease. And sort of the last thing I wanted to just put in was that when I was finishing my edits of this book, a new publication came out, and it was another bioarchaeological study, so another from skeletons. And it was looking at the origins of smallpox and the smallpox virus, trying to find the first possible evidence of it in Europe. Well, actually, I think they looked in Americas as well, but especially in Europe. It turns out that even going back, many thousands of years, the first evidence of it coming to Europe was in the Viking Age, and it was with the Vikings, and it was from a number of locations across Scandinavia, England, and in Eastern Europe. And as I dug through that a bit further, I noticed that actually several of them were on the riverine sites in Eastern Europe. Several were in island locations that we know were key to the silver coming in from the east. And some were also from fur trading sites, where, again, we know that those sort of big eastern connections were taking part. So writing that in the first lockdown, when we were sort of not allowed to travel because disease could travel, was a really kind of interesting parallel, I think, to show that those global networks opened up in the Viking Age, very much brought a lot of things both to the east and to the west. So I think that's probably the end of what I wanted to say, William.
Brilliant. Oh, I mean, it's just such a thrilling and unexpected world. For our Indian audience, can you just talk a little bit about the eastern end of this? So, give a picture of what's happening in 9th century Gujarat. Presumably, the Islamic world has got as far as Sindh, about Karachi, and then we've got Hindu kingdoms in Gujarat below that.
Yeah, I think you probably know far more than me about that end of it. it's a little bit vague on that. So I'm not sure I can really...
in the shallows. It's the most fascinating world.
Yeah,
but
I think.
Are we talking Vikings actually sort of sailing from Samarkand to Gujarat to do business with the Gujus, or is it intermediaries? How is this happening?
I think they're tapping into the Arabic networks, the trading networks that we know are set up. I think from about the 7th century onwards, there's evidence of Arab traders. So I think that's where they link from places like Baghdad, go further east. So we know certainly that by the 10th century, 9th and 10th century, when my bead would have travelled, those communities, those trading communities would have been very, very well established, and that going towards Baghdad is then just a real key. And I think it's really perhaps going as far as Baghdad and then just catching up on that trade. So I don't think we don't have any evidence. We have some Anglo-Saxon or English sources of some Christian communities in the sort of, I think, late 9th or early 10th century.
Yes, a visit from King Alfred to go and see. He sends some people off to get relics of St. Thomas in Kerala, doesn't he?
Yes, exactly. So there is knowledge, and there are people.
English reference to India in any English text?
Yes, absolutely. So there is some knowledge there and some connection, but that's all we know. There's no archaeological evidence. There's no other written sources. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but as far as we know at the moment, it's probably intermediaries.
So what are we talking? Are we talking sort of Gujus sailing off in the way they still do, and with all these Gujarati trading communities still working between East Africa, for example, and Gujarat, or the Gulf and Gujarat? Are we talking about Gujus in the Middle East, or are we talking the Arabs bringing it to the Middle East and meeting Vikings there? If you had to take what's the most likely scenario in your head for this bead from Gujarat arriving in Derbyshire?
I think it's probably very much like it is now. So these pebbles come up from the mountains, they go down to the coast, and they're being traded and met by ships there that come probably from the Middle East and eastwards, and then take goods home. That would be my guess as the most likely, because we know that sort of eastwards trade is certainly happening at that point. But who knows?
And so we don't actually have any documentary evidence of Vikings being seen east of Constantinople.
No, well, apart from the Caspian Sea. So we've got around the Caspian Sea, which technically is so further east. So we've got a number of raids described on the shores of the Caspian, including the southern end. Some of those sources,
northern Iran, we're talking, they're raiding.
Yes, Azerbaijan as well being raided quite extensively, and so we've got those. If I put my map back up, so we've got various shores of the Caspian being attacked. Some of those sources suggest that they were actually trying to set up settlements and they were trying to claim territory. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but they were always being fought off completely. So we know that there's a few were trading across to Baghdad, but that's again also the only other sort of source of evidence is of people being able to speak the language, being able to communicate. It's possible that some of these are those slaves that are being taken to Baghdad, and they can then communicate with the Rus traders and Scandinavian traders. We don't know, but their sources are just so slim. Another reason I think is
quite a lot of stuff turning up, isn't it? I mean, as well as the dirhams, which you say, which are in large numbers, both in Britain and larger still in Scandinavia, where you've got hundreds of thousands of thousands of dirhams turning up in Scandinavia, hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands, yeah, literally. And those are the ones that are not being melted down. The rest have been melted down, so we don't even know. So yeah, it's vast quantities.
And then I saw in the summer in Edinburgh, they were putting on the Galloway Hoard, which has got a Zoroastrian pot from Samarkand sitting in Western Scotland. I mean, how does that get there?
Yeah, it'll be the same trading networks. So it'll be these points of trade, and these objects, these exotic objects, are so valuable in this time. So there's the idea. I don't know if it's because of the connections, if it's a way of demonstrating that you have access, or if it's own travel, if it's sort of. So we've got some wonderful jewelry, some burials as well, and hoards from Scandinavia that just have a remarkable number of locations that the objects are from, and they must have known where they came from. They must have known something. So I think we'd be naive to think that they just think it was a pretty unusual trinket. I think people at the time knew exactly how far those things had traveled, and those connections were being emphasized.
Wonderful Gandara Buddha you showed us from, I think, Sweden. Is there any idea that anyone knows what that is, or are they just randomly taking a pretty thing and sort of putting it on their mantelpiece?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So it actually, when it was found, it had a leather band around the neck of the statue. So it looked like it was suspended, that somebody was actually carrying it around their neck. That's kind of all we know. But we do know later on there are a lot of different religions in these trading places. So you do have, there's some suggestion that there were Muslims in some parts of Scandinavian trading towns. We've got various people from around the North Sea and from the Baltic with very different cultures and clearly different religions. I mean, it's not impossible that you have missionaries, because we know we definitely do have missionaries coming into Scandinavia. So it's not impossible that knowledge was there. I think, again, we have to not be naive and think, these were dumb people. They're really not. They're very knowledgeable, even though it's not written down, it's carried across. So it's possible.
Kat, I think we're out of time now. I've just got a message saying we're at the limit, but how extraordinary. I would recommend this book to anyone. It's a fantastic example of how to make archaeology accessible, but also it's a deeply scholarly book. It's got an incredible amount of new research that you can read nowhere else. And it's got funeral orgies and Greek fire and witches and beats any of those Netflix Viking sagas, because you know it's true.
Yeah.
Final question: was Lothgar Rush? What was he called? The guy in the television Netflix series Vikings, Lothgar Rushbrook.
Ragnar Lothbrok.
Ragnar Lothbrok. Was he was at Repton, at your site, wasn't he?
Possibly. We don't know if it's true or not, but there's a theory that he might have been. So that is the connection. Yes.
Brilliant. So anyway, put down your Netflix and pick up River Kings, and you'll have a much more exciting time. Thank you very much, Cat Jarman.
Thank you so much, William.